When it comes to answering short response questions in science exams, it's really helpful to use a scaffold or some sort of guide you can fall back on that's going to help you maximize your marks. Now, this video is going to outline one particular scaffold that you can use, and the focus for this video is going to be on biology, but it can be used across a range of different science subjects. First of all, let's talk about why you would use a scaffold. Now, when it comes to marking exams at the end of the year, what we find more often than not is most students are able to get some marks for nearly every question. But the difference between the top-end students and then the rest of the cohort is not about the top-end students knowing more. It's more that they know how to answer the questions properly, that they're not losing easy marks because they forgot to add something to their answer. And they're also not over-answering the question either. So scaffolds can be helpful because they give you a framework to base your answers on. And once you've got that framework, you know how to guide your answer. Scaffolds can ensure you define the terms in the question, and by defining the terms in the question, that's going to highlight to the marker that you understand what's going on. A scaffold can help to show your train of thought and helps you to formulate your answer and structure the answer in a way that makes sense. And a scaffold can also ensure that you actually answer the question as it is asked as well. So the scaffold that I want to talk about is the IDEAE with an E scaffold, which is part of the alarm matrix that you might be familiar with. Now, each of these letters stand for a word. The I stands for identify, and identify means to recognise a name. It's one of the lower level verbs that you might see in an end of year exam question. The D stands for describe, which is provide characteristics and features of the thing that you've identified. Explain is all about relating cause and effect, so making those connections, making those relationships between the features clear and evident. It might involve providing a why or a how as well. And then the A stands for assess, and assess is really about making a judgment of value or quality, outcomes, results or size. And in order to assess anything properly, you need to provide evidence for your assessment. And that comes through the identify, describe and explain. Now the extra E is for evaluate. And evaluate is making a judgment based on the criteria. Normally it's a criteria given to you in the question. So let's have a look at how these things work together. Now, identify is going to be the basis of all of your questions that you have in any of your end of year exams. Then we're going to have describe, which will be the next step. Explain, analyze, and evaluate. So this is going to be the basic building blocks of any question you're going to get asked in an exam in science or biology particularly. Now, identify means to identify what is the main component. So what is the question asking you to talk about? That's the thing you're going to identify. Now, the key thing here to realise is if you're going to describe, explain, analyse or evaluate, you still need to identify first of all. And that's why all of these blocks are part of the whole scaffold. Now, when it comes to describing something, that's that next step. We're going to talk about the features and the characteristics of the thing that you've identified. Now, again, if you're going to explain, analyse or evaluate something, you need to also describe it first of all. When it comes to explain, this is the cause and effect, the relationships, what's the function or the purpose, and giving evidence can be helpful here. When it comes to analyse, we want to talk about what is the impact. And when it comes to evaluate, to what extent is the impact effective? Now, the key thing I want you to take away from this particular graphic here is the idea that if you're going to analyse something, you need to do all of these steps here first before you can get to the analyse part of the question. If you jump straight in with an analysis and it's a 5-mark question, you might get 1 or 2 marks for that. But if you don't identify, describe or explain, you're not going to get the full marks for an analysed question, no matter how good your analysis is. Likewise with evaluate or justify or any of those really higher order ones, you need to do all of this work beforehand to provide the evidence so that your evaluation makes sense in the end. Now, each of these I, D, E, A and E linked to specific HSC verbs. And I'm sure you've seen a list of HSC verbs before. So this scaffold is really a way to kind of help you classify each of those HSC verbs into the type of answer that the question's asking for. So identifying the main concept, these are the type of verbs we would see. Classify, define, identify, list, outline, recall, recount, recognise. They're the sort of verbs you would see in a question in an end of year exam, such as define homeostasis or outline what a prokaryotic cell is. Now these are the verbs that relate to describe, so clarify, classify, contrast, describe, discuss, extract, exemplify. Some of these verbs we see more commonly in science and biology than we do in other subjects. But again, just realising that when you see these words, the question's really asking you to describe something. When we see words or verbs like account, elaborate, explain, explore, compare, demonstrate, interpret, these are part of the explain part of the scaffold. So if you're asked to compare something, say, lizards and birds, you need to identify the lizard and bird, you need to describe what they are before you can compare the two. Analyse is the how and the why, so verbs like analyse, apply, again compare can be in this one. Construct, contrast, compare and contrast often will go together. Distinguish, examine, extrapolate, discuss, interpret, predict, synthesise. All of these verbs, when you see them, relate to analyse. So if you're going to contrast or distinguish something, you need to identify, describe and explain before you get to that distinguish part of the question. And then evaluate is all about providing evidence and then assessing that evidence. So things like assess, appreciate, compare again, compare and contrast, critically evaluate, discuss, evaluate itself, investigate, justify, propose, recommend. All of these verbs, when you see them in a question, if you want to maximise your marks and you've got an evaluate the evidence for evolution, for example, then you need to identify what that evidence for evolution is, describe what it is, explain how it relates to evolution, analyse all of that, and then eventually evaluate that as well. And that's how you're going to maximise your marks. So let's have a couple of examples here to try and apply this all together. So the first example here is a really relatively easy question. It's an outline question. So outline one similarity and one difference between osmosis and diffusion. This would be worth probably about 3 marks in an end of year exam. So let's highlight the key words here. So the key verb is outline. An outline is one of those lower level verbs. It's going to be part of our I, or identify part of our scaffold. And so we want to identify one similarity and one difference between osmosis and diffusion. Now this is worth 3 marks, so we want to have at least one similarity and probably extrapolate the difference into 2 different things. So this is a sample answer that you might come up with. So both osmosis and diffusion involve passive movement, so that is a similarity. And then osmosis is the passive movement of water or a solvent from an area of high solvent concentration to an area of low solvent concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. So there I've identified what osmosis is, and I've identified the difference between osmosis and diffusion. And then diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So again, I've identified what diffusion is and used that as a way of explaining what the difference is, or identifying what the difference is. So this is the sort of response we would expect for 3 marks in a question like this. All right, let's have a look at this question here. So this question is, using specific examples, describe how models can be used to improve our understanding of complex biological concepts. And I put this all together on one slide just so we can talk through it. Now, it's asking us to describe how models can be used to improve our understanding of complex biological concepts. So if we're going to plan our answer, we could write IDEAE down the side of the page, but because this is described, we're going to stop at D. So what are our examples? It's asking for examples, so we need to come up with more than one. And then D, describe the examples and link to the understanding of those concepts, those biological concepts. So we look at the I part of our answer here. So I've identified the fluid mosaic model as being a model used in biology. And I've also picked another model, which was a model of natural selection that our class did using lollies and utensils. So that's the I part. So that gives us a mark each straight away, just for answering those two parts there by identifying them. And then the description comes through the rest of it, describing the reason for the fluid mosaic model. The name for that is because of the phospholipid bilayer and how fluid moves around and how things within it fit together like a mosaic. And then describing the use of the lollies and the utensils in our natural selection prac that we did as well. All right, this next question comes from the HSC. And the question here was analyse factors that could have contributed to the change in global distribution of both dengue fever and malaria over the last 100 years. Support your answer with reference to the data provided. Now, a couple of key things just to realise here. This is 32B, which means 32A would have led you into this particular question. But let's look at the verbs here and break down some of this. So, analyse. So this is a higher end one. We're looking at IDEA. We're looking at that A level of scaffold for our answer. And support your answer with reference to the data provided. So in this case, the data provided is this picture, or there may have been a table or some sort of graph earlier on that we can also refer to. Now, in this question, it specifically says support your answer with reference to the data provided. And if there is data provided, if there's a picture, if there's a graph, if there's anything there to help you with your answer, whether it asks you to refer to it or not, you should always refer to it. It's there for a reason, and the reason is the markers want you to be able to analyse this picture or analyse the data in this picture. So make sure when there's a picture or there's a graph or there's a table that you directly reference that data. Okay. So here is the answer. Now, I'm not going to read this all out, but I want you to be able to pause this and read this answer for yourself. But I want to just highlight how I've used the IDEAE scaffold in this answer. So the first part is identify. And so here we've identified mosquito vectors, or mosquitoes acting as a vector carrying disease. We've then described, and these are the things that have possibly led to that increase in dengue fever in those areas. We've explained, we've made that relationship clear, or that cause and effect clear. And then here is our analyse part of our response. So again, this is just to highlight how you would break apart a question like this and how that scaffold can not only help you plan, but also help you with your answer to make sure you're ticking all those boxes you need to get those 4 or 5 marks out of 5. All right, I want to finish with some other hints, and these are the hints that come from NESA, and these are general things we see when we mark HSC or mark Year 11 exams, and these are things NESA have highlighted as well. So NESA recommends that students should communicate succinctly and logically using correct biological terminology. So this means being very direct and to the point, but make sure you use biological terminology wherever you can. Now, if you forget the name of something, that's fine. You can still write a great answer without remembering the technical term of mitochondria or endoplasmic reticulum. But if you can remember those terms, that's going to step you up to that different level of answer. Read carefully the question to ensure that is understood before responding. And this is a really good tip for no matter what exam you're doing. Make sure you read the question carefully. It's really common for students when they're under the stress of an exam situation to misread a question or think they're answering the question when actually they're not answering it at all. Engage with any stimulus material provided and refer to it in their response. So I've bolded this one. This is what I was just talking about before with the pictures and the graphs. You need to engage with that stimulus. You need to tell us you've looked at it and you've understood it because you've included it in your answer. Practice skills in applying knowledge to unfamiliar scenarios. And so this is really where the HSC is headed to now, where we know that you can do basic skills like a Punnett square or a pedigree, but can you apply those Punnett square skills to, say, a pigeon genetics, which have a different chromosome number and a different type of chromosome for their sex chromosomes than what humans would have, for example? So again, practicing those skills in unfamiliar scenarios. Use the key word to answer the question. For example, identify the trends rather than explaining the trends. So again, this is where reading the question is going to be really helpful, and having that scaffold so you know that identify means something different to explaining. It's still really common that we might see a question where it says identify the trends of whatever it might be, a predator-prey relationship, and rather than just identifying that the predator goes up and then the prey comes down, people or students rather try to explain that trend rather than just purely identifying it goes up and then it goes down. So they're either not addressing the question, so they're losing easy marks, or they're over answering the question and losing potential marks. Writing a brief plan for longer responses to assist in structuring each response in a logical way. So this is where that IDEAE scaffold will really help you out. You can just jot down IDEA or whatever letters you need for your question, and just put some dot points there, just so you know where you're headed with your response. The other thing is, if you do happen to run out of time and you've got that plan there, sometimes you might be able to get some marks for that, because we can see, all right, so they didn't finish their answer, we can see where they were going, and you may get a mark even though you may not complete your answer. And use skills and information from across modules to answer questions where appropriate. We do break down biology into 4 modules in Year 11 and 4 modules in Year 12, but realising that really they're not separate modules, they all kind of blend together, and understanding how they blend together. Particularly, for example, if we're looking at something like non-infectious diseases and the genetics of inheritance of non-infectious diseases, and maybe the genetic technologies that we can use to help treat those diseases. There we have one question that might cover 3 modules from Year 12. So being able to apply that learning from across the year, and not necessarily just think of it as a Module 1 or a Module 3 or a Module 7 question, but realising it may be asking different parts from different modules.